Picture this. April 8th, 1917, 11:47 p.m., exactly 13 hours before the largest Canadian military operation in history. A German artillery observer named Klaus Reinhardt is standing in what he believes is the safest position on the Western Front, 70 feet above the battlefield inside a reinforced concrete observation post on Vimy Ridge. He's been at this post for 8 months, and in all that time, not a single Allied bullet has come close to touching him. The walls are 3 feet thick, the viewing slit is barely 6 inches wide, and he's positioned so far back from the opening that hitting him would require a bullet to thread through that narrow gap and travel another 12 feet into darkness. It's mathematically impossible. Or at least that's what Klaus believes as he raises his binoculars to scan the Canadian lines one final time before the night shift change. The sound comes first, a crack so sharp it seems to split the air itself, and then Klaus Reinhardt, the man who thought he was untouchable, drops to the floor, struck by a single impossible shot. The other German soldiers in the bunker freeze because they've just witnessed something that defies every tactical assumption they've ever made about warfare. Somewhere out there in the frozen mud of no man's land, in complete darkness, a Canadian sniper has just made a shot that shouldn't exist, and this is only the beginning of the nightmare that's about to unfold on Vimy Ridge. Let me give you the context that makes this moment so terrifying for the Germans, because Vimy Ridge wasn't just another hill, it was the place where the French Empire had sent 60,000 men to die in a single offensive, where the British had lost another 40,000 in follow-up attacks, and where every military strategist in Europe had concluded that a frontal assault was essentially a suicide mission dressed up as a battle plan. The ridge itself rises about 200 feet above the surrounding flatlands, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that in trench warfare, even 20 feet of elevation is the difference between seeing everything and seeing nothing.
From the top of Vimy, German artillery observers could call down precision fire on any Allied position for miles in every direction. They could watch troop movements in real time. They could turn every supply route into a killing field. And they'd been doing exactly that for 3 solid years. The fortifications were obscene. We're talking about a defensive system that included concrete bunkers with walls thick enough to withstand direct hits from the heaviest artillery shells, machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that turned the slope into an automated death trap, multiple layers of barbed wire so dense that British soldiers had reported spending 40 minutes trying to cut through just to reach the German trenches, and a network of tunnels so extensive that German troops could move reinforcements to any threatened sector without ever exposing themselves to Allied fire. Over 150,000 French and British soldiers had already died trying to take this position, and the German High Command was so confident in its impregnability that they'd started using Vimy Ridge as a rest sector for units that had been mauled on other parts of the front. But then the Canadians showed up, and they brought with them something the Germans had never encountered before, a tactical philosophy that would fundamentally change how modern militaries think about precision warfare. Here's what made the Canadian Corps different. And I need you to understand, this isn't nationalist mythology. This is documented tactical evolution that military historians still study today. A significant portion of the Canadian soldiers weren't career military men who'd learned to shoot on a rifle range. They were frontiersmen from the wilderness regions of Canada, men who'd grown up hunting in conditions where missing your shot meant your family didn't eat that winter, where reading animal tracks and understanding wind patterns and camouflage weren't military skills, but basic survival requirements.
When these men arrived at the Western Front and saw how European armies were fighting, throwing masses of soldiers at entrenched positions in broad daylight, they recognized it as fundamentally insane from a hunting perspective. One Canadian officer, a former fur trapper named Patrick, wrote in his diary that watching a British assault was like watching someone try to catch a deer by running directly at it while screaming. It violated every principle of stalking and ambush that made hunting effective. So the Canadians started to innovate, and the first innovation was recognizing that before you could take Vimy Ridge with an infantry assault, you had to systematically neutralize every German soldier who could observe your preparations. They needed to blind the enemy, eliminate the observers. the artillery spotters, the machine gun crews, anyone whose eyes gave the Germans their tactical advantage, and they needed to do it from distances and under conditions that would make the Germans believe they were fighting ghosts instead of men. The Canadian sniper training program that emerged in early 1917 was unlike anything the British or French were doing, because it wasn't based on European military doctrine, it was based on indigenous hunting techniques that had been refined over thousands of years. They started with camouflage, but not the way you're thinking, not just wearing green or brown uniforms and hoping for the best. Canadian snipers would spend hours constructing what they called second skins, burlap and canvas suits that they would coat in mud from the specific sector where they'd be operating. Then they would attach vegetation that was native to that exact area, not just any grass or leaves, but the specific plants that grew in no man's land, so that even if a German observer looked directly at them through binoculars, the human eye would register them as part of the landscape. They would crawl into position at 2 or 3 in the morning, moving so slowly that it could take 6 hours to travel 100 yards, and once they reached their hide, they would remain absolutely motionless for 12, 15, sometimes 20 hours at a stretch.
But the camouflage was only half the equation. The real terror was what they did once they achieved complete invisibility. One sniper named John described the psychological challenge of this, saying that after 8 hours of lying in frozen mud without moving, your body starts screaming at you to shift position. Your muscles cramp. Your bladder feels like it's going to burst. Insects crawl into your uniform and bite you, and you have to train your mind to completely disconnect from these sensations, because even the smallest movement, just brushing away a fly, could catch a German observer's attention and compromise your position. But the Canadians had an advantage that European soldiers didn't. Many of them had spent entire winters in the Canadian wilderness, where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, where staying still and quiet in brutal conditions wasn't a military exercise, but the difference between tracking a moose successfully or freezing to death while lost. They brought that mental toughness to Vimy Ridge, and it terrified the Germans. Now let's talk about the Ross rifle, because this is where the story gets technically fascinating and reveals something unexpected about how warfare actually works. The Ross was initially issued to all Canadian infantry, and it was an unmitigated disaster in trench warfare. The mechanism jammed constantly in mud. Soldiers reported that the bolt could be reassembled incorrectly in a way that would cause the rifle to explode when fired, and Canadian infantrymen were literally throwing away their Ross rifles and picking up British Lee Enfields from fallen soldiers because the Ross was getting them neutralized in combat. The Canadian military command was on the verge of scrapping the entire weapon system, but then the snipers intervened and said, wait, for our purposes, this rifle is perfect. The rifle that was getting Canadian soldiers eliminated in close quarters combat was about to become the deadliest precision weapon on the Western Front.
See, the Ross had been designed as a target-shooting rifle before the war. It had a straight-pull bolt action that was faster than traditional rotating bolts. The barrel was manufactured to incredibly tight tolerances, which made it more accurate than almost any other infantry rifle in service. And it was chambered for a high-velocity round that retained accuracy at longer ranges than standard military ammunition. For regular infantry in muddy trenches who needed to fire rapidly and reliably, these advantages didn't matter because the rifle would jam on the 4th or 5th shot. But for a sniper who was taking one carefully aimed shot from a concealed position and then remaining hidden for hours, the Ross was a precision instrument that outperformed anything the Germans or British had. Canadian snipers began modifying their Ross rifles even further, adding makeshift scopes, adjusting triggers to require less pressure so the act of firing wouldn't disturb their aim, experimenting with different types of ammunition to find loads that performed best at specific ranges. They turned a failed infantry weapon into the most effective sniper system on the Western Front, and German soldiers started reporting a phenomenon they couldn't explain. Canadians were consistently hitting targets at ranges where accurate fire shouldn't be possible. What made Canadian snipers truly dangerous wasn't just their shooting ability, it was their approach to intelligence gathering and target selection. They were operating like modern special operations forces decades before that concept even existed. They didn't just find a good spot and engage whatever Germans happened to walk by. They conducted what we would now call battlefield reconnaissance and pattern analysis. Canadian sniper teams would spend days just watching the German lines through telescopes and periscopes, not firing a single shot, just collecting data. They would note when German officers made their rounds, which routes they took, what time supply deliveries arrived, where machine gun crews changed shifts, any pattern or routine that could be exploited.
One Canadian sniper unit created detailed maps of the German trench system that were more accurate than what Allied intelligence had, because they weren't relying on aerial photography or captured prisoners. They were directly observing German behavior over weeks and identifying the critical nodes in their defensive network. Then they would prioritize targets based not on opportunity but on tactical impact. German officers were the highest priority because neutralizing them created command confusion. Artillery observers were next because they were the eyes that directed German firepower, then machine gun crews, then communication runners. The Germans started to notice that their casualties weren't random. The Canadians were systematically degrading the most critical positions in their defensive structure first, which meant that even when the casualty count seemed relatively low, the degradation of German combat effectiveness was catastrophic. A German regimental commander wrote in February 1917 that he'd lost more officers in 3 weeks of Canadian sniper activity than he'd lost in 6 months of conventional combat, and that his remaining officers were so terrified of the Canadian shadows that they were refusing to conduct routine inspections of the forward trenches because they knew it would compromise their survival. And then there's Francis Pegahmagabow, and I need to tell you his story because it encapsulates everything that made Canadian snipers so effective, while also revealing something about how history remembers warfare. Pegahmagabow was an Anishinaabe First Nations soldier from Ontario. He'd grown up hunting and trapping in the wilderness north of Georgian Bay, and when he enlisted in the Canadian Army in 1914, he already possessed skills that European military academies couldn't teach. His military service record documented the highest number of confirmed enemy combatant eliminations in the entire British Empire during World War I, with official documentation showing 378 verified tactical neutralizations and an unknown number of additional engagements that weren't officially recorded. To put that in perspective using official military records, the most successful German sniper had around 100 confirmed engagements. The most successful British sniper had around 150. Pegahmagabow was operating at a level that suggested he understood something fundamental about human behavior in combat that others didn't. His technique was based on patience that bordered on superhuman. He would identify a German position and then wait, sometimes for days, until the perfect moment when a high-value target would expose themselves for just a few seconds. German soldiers reported that there were sectors of the Vimy line where they knew a Canadian sniper was operating. They could feel it, but they couldn't locate him, couldn't suppress him, couldn't do anything except hope they weren't the next target. Pegahmagabow also worked as a scout and message runner, which meant he was regularly crawling through no man's land under fire, and he survived the entire war without serious injury, which in itself was almost statistically impossible given what he was doing. But here's the part that should make you question how we remember history. After the war, Pegahmagabow returned to Canada and spent decades fighting for basic rights for Indigenous people. He died in poverty, and for most of the 20th century, Canadian military history barely mentioned him because he didn't fit the narrative that the Canadian establishment wanted to tell about the war. It wasn't until 1999, 73 years after his death, that he was inducted into the Canadian Forces Hall of Fame. And even today, most people have never heard of the most effective precision marksman in British Empire history because we prefer our war heroes to look a certain way. By April 9, 1917, when the main Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge began, the German defenders were already psychologically broken in ways that traditional bombardment could never achieve.
Yes, the Canadians had subjected the ridge to the most intense artillery preparation in military history up to that point. And yes, they'd innovated new tactics, like the creeping barrage, where artillery fire moved forward at a walking pace, with infantry following right behind it. But what made the German defense collapse so quickly was that for weeks beforehand, Canadian snipers had been systematically degrading their command structure and neutralizing anyone who tried to organize a coherent resistance. When Canadian infantry emerged from their trenches at 5:30 a.m. and began advancing up the slope, they weren't facing the coordinated defense that had stopped French and British troops in earlier assaults. They were facing German units whose officers had been eliminated, whose machine gun crews had been suppressed, whose artillery observers had been neutralized. units that had spent weeks living in constant fear of an enemy they couldn't see. The assault succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The Canadians took the entire ridge in less than 4 days. A position that was supposed to be impregnable fell because a relatively small group of soldiers had understood that before you win the battle, you have to win the hunt. German prisoners reported that the psychological effect of the Canadian snipers was more devastating than the artillery bombardment, because you can hide from artillery in a deep bunker, but you couldn't hide from men who could engage you from 800 yards away through a 6-inch gap in complete darkness. The tactical lessons from Vimy Ridge influenced how modern militaries think about special operations and precision warfare. The idea that a small number of highly trained specialists can degrade an enemy's capability more effectively than massive conventional forces, that's a direct legacy of what the Canadians proved on Vimy Ridge. So what do we take from this? Why does this story matter in 2026, beyond just being an interesting historical footnote?
Because the ghost snipers of Vimy Ridge demonstrated something that our modern technology-obsessed military culture sometimes forgets, that the most sophisticated weapon system in the world is still a trained human being who understands their environment and their enemy. Every modern sniper training program, whether it's U.S. Marine Corps Scout Snipers, British SAS, Canadian JTF-2, Russian Spetsnaz, they all teach principles that were pioneered by frontiersmen from Ontario and Indigenous scouts like Pegahmagabow on the muddy slopes of Vimy Ridge. The emphasis on camouflage and concealment, the patient observation of enemy patterns, the prioritization of high-value targets, the psychological warfare of making your enemy fear an invisible threat, all of that comes directly from the Canadian experience in World War I. And there's something poetic about the fact that the most effective precision marksmen in that war weren't produced by elite military academies or years of formal training. They were men who'd learned to hunt in the wilderness and simply applied those same principles to a different kind of challenge. The Germans called them shadows. They called them ghosts. They called them the invisible death. But what they really were was the future of precision warfare. And that future was born in the frozen mud of Vimy Ridge, when a group of Canadian hunters decided that if European armies didn't know how to fight a war, they'd show them how it's done. If you want to understand how a nation of hunters changed military history forever, if you want more stories about the tactical innovations that modern forces still use today, subscribe to The War History, because we're just getting started. And I promise you, the next investigation will be even more shocking than this one.